Great. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's been very interesting to hear what everyone's saying and to take part. And I'll try and go as quickly as possible because I know we're all probably getting very hungry and keen to get some lunch and get out into the sunshine for a little bit. Yes, I'm from the Greater London Authority, working on delivery of the London Food Strategy and working to support the work of the London Food Board. London is quite an anomaly for a city of its size to have a food board and a food strategy, to have a food policy team. There's 3 of us working at Greater London Authority. Ostensibly, we have a deputy mayor for food in the shape of the chair of the London Food Board, Rosie Boycott. She doesn't have that title. However, she sits in the mayor's office, and because of her connections and her friendship with the mayor of London, we get a sort of commensurate amount of influence. It's not a structure that we've seen replicated in other cities of the size and complexity of London, and I'll be very happy for someone to point out a picture of it. Toronto, I think, is a good example, but I don't think it's quite the size and complexity of London, and but I'm happy for someone to disagree with me. Going back to Adrian's presentation, this whole idea of the lack of power in some of these food strategies and some of these food boards, I think we're very lucky and we've slightly overcome that through the influence of the chair of the London Food Board, but I'll talk a little bit more about her work as we go through. It's famously said that food sits in 14 central government departments or ministries. In London, we see food as a holistic issue, and we focus it in one department. It's very interesting to look at policy through the lens of food as the key policy driver, because quite often it's seen sitting in those separate compartments. So we have a very interesting lens through which to look at things. But London is slightly different. Does it work? I don't know if it does. Okay, doesn't matter. As our indomitable mayor likes to say, London is the greatest city on earth. Again, I'm very happy to be challenged. That's his words, not mine. But you can't disagree. Sitting here today in this lovely surroundings and out there, and you walk around all those gorgeous museums and that beautiful park, it is a pretty special place. 8 million people, 10 million when you take all of the visitors who come in every day and leave. 33 separate local authorities, that's the complexity of London government. Directly elected mayor, Mr Johnson, who you probably have seen or heard of before. The Greater London Authority is his delivery organisation for the delivery of his policies, and then a Greater London Assembly to offer scrutiny in the background. An interesting statistic, London is the greenest city of its size in the world. More than 40% of London space is green or blue, water or green space. Approximately 30 million meals consumed every day. That's a lot of food. And, we are the greatest city on earth, as Mayor says, and we're the fattest city in Europe, so we're winning on all counts. I think it's well, it's been well set out during other people's talks, but you require action for good food on all levels. And nationally, we have some fairly interesting but pretty weak guidance on healthy and sustainable food, the most prominent of which is Food 2030, set up by the last government, adopted by this government but not really driven forward. Again, somebody might contradict me on that. London has a food strategy since 2006, and that provides our strategic framework as well as an implementation plan. We've had 2 of those so far, but then because of our structure, government structure, this local 33 boroughs, many of which have taken the approach replicated the approach at London level to create their own food policy groups, food strategy councils, and then you have activity on a local level. This is a fantastic project based in East London called Growing Communities, an alternative food network. The main idea behind the initial food strategy was to create and foster the alternative food networks that as we're describing them here today, but also trying to affect change on where most Londoners get their food from. So to make the food system more equitable, healthy, just. That's the aim of the strategy. So it's to bring the grassroots alternative food networks and allow them to prosper, but then also green and change and engage the conventional food system where most people still source their food and try and improve it little by little. How did we get to where we might have beaten Toronto, actually, if it wasn't for Margaret Thatcher, because Margaret Thatcher disbanded the Greater London Council in 1980-something, and they actually produced a fantastic food policy for London in 1982, and I've got a copy of it. I can share it with people if you'd like to see it. Really interesting stuff. It talks about peak oil, amazingly, in 1982, really focused on the issue of peak oil. But the context for the London Food Strategy is a context of crisis at a national level. Foot and mouth disease, BSE, the Don Curry's report on the future of food and farming, and that recommended local food strategy boards be established across the UK. In this area, that was taken up by a strategy board for the South East. But then, by a quirk of fate, during Ken Livingstone's first term as Mayor of London, he needed support of the Green Party to get his budgets through the London Assembly. So to do that, he did a deal with the Green Party. He said, you can be the deputy mayor, you can hold the deputy mayoralty for 1 year if you vote through my budgets. And so they happily agreed, and Jenny Jones became the deputy mayor for a year with a portfolio, with the authority and a budget to create new initiatives around environmental sustainability. She went out to her constituents and everyone said, we want somebody to take a hold of food at a strategic level. Mainly it was driven by Sustain, a London-based food and farming charity. They said, the South East region doesn't represent London's food strategy needs. London is a completely independent beast from the South East. It sucks in resources. That's all it really does, sucks in resources. And that needs to be looked at from its own particular perspective. So the board was set up in 2004, a year-long process to develop strategy, amazing consultation. At the time I was based in a small food poverty charity in East London. They came out, they held a big forum with all the local people in East London and talked to us about what we thought we needed in a food strategy. So a fantastic collaborative engagement process, and that developed the strategy. 2007, first implementation plan, and then in 2008 we had a new administration. Our famous mayor came into being, and there was a moment of sort of uneasiness and crisis. It's like, is he going to get this? Are we going to be burnt in the bonfire of the Quangos like loads of other things? Are we going to go the same way as the London Development Agency? Luckily, he didn't decide to throw us on the fire, and he appointed Rosie Boycott as the new chair, taking over from Jenny Jones, and actually, it's strangely enough, it's led to a huge expansion from our perspective of the influence and profile of the work that we've done. Mainly due to the fact that our chair is a very well-known and high-profile personality who can get things across. I don't think Boris really gets food. He doesn't get it in this holistic sense. But the great thing is that he's got a vision of Britain, and therefore of London, as a green and pleasant land. And what the chair of the London Food Board has been able to do very adeptly is to use that as the way of getting food into his agenda. The London Food Board, I think it's a really interesting place to sit, and so, Ed from Food Trade is a member of our board, and I hope he finds it enjoyable and gets some benefits from it. But it brings together these alternative food networks that you're talking about with some of the biggest players in the industry, Tesco, Sainsbury's, the National Farmers Union, and it puts them all together to have these very interesting, sometimes tense, but quite often, actually, amazingly, the agendas seem to coalesce very, very, very well around the policies that we're trying to implement in London. So what do we do? One of our main roles is to try and influence policy in the in the round in London. So we've had a number of successes. The London Plan now has a section around the protection of land for food growing, which is really an important political win. Health inequality strategies, there's a big focus on improving access for healthy food. Climate change strategy, any day now we're about to produce a fantastic report on Scope 3 emissions. All cities in the world and nations in the world since Kyoto have been bound to report on their carbon emissions. Wonderfully for the United Kingdom, since 1991, our carbon emissions have gone down. We've done brilliantly. We're solving climate change. Well, no, we're not, because what we've done is we've continued the process of deindustrialisation and we've exported all of those carbon emissions to another part of the world. No one reports on those, and no one has to. London will be the first city in the world to report on its Scope 3 emissions. And in that report, food goes from barely registering as a climate change contributor to becoming around about 18% of London's total carbon emissions because of our food sector. That piece of work will be published by the climate change team, as I said, any day now, so keep an eye out for it on our website. It's groundbreaking. The methodology, that you can debate that until the cows come home, to use a food metaphor, but it's a really groundbreaking piece of work. We've created a waste strategy where there's a creation of a food waste hierarchy within that. We did that with people from the Feeding the 5,000, and that's been adopted by businesses across the United Kingdom, and it's even got quite high profile in Europe now. And we've made a commitment to Zero Hunger City, which is part of the Mayor's London 2020 vision, his sort of strategic vision for the next 6 years, and he's made a commitment which actually will be very, very difficult for him to meet, of Zero Hunger City. So I think in the end we are trying to change, we're trying to promote alternative food networks, but we're trying to also change the food system and the big food system. And I think this is a really good example of how we've used our position of influence to change policy that had a massive effect. The Olympics is considered the largest the largest peacetime catering operation in the world, and something like 9 million meals delivered on site every day. We did a very good piece of work to influence the London Organising Committee of the 2012 Games to introduce standards, and of course these weren't the most amazing standards in the world, but for the first time they included stuff around sustainability of fish, sustainability of local seasonal produce, fair trade tea, coffee, sugar and wine, and health and nutrition guidelines. And Martin Carracher was right. Actually, McDonald's did most of their work on sustainability prior to the Games, and that was actually the result of one CEO that they had for a number of years in the late 90s and early 2000s who really loved this agenda. Actually, it's not part of the corporate DNA. He did it. He drove it through. But during the Olympics, pressure from us and other campaigning organisations forced them to stop sourcing their chicken from Brazil and to source it from Britain instead. But on top of policy, there's also a role for implementation. And this is where we sort of try and balance the approach of promoting and developing alternative food networks in London and greening the rest. So we've done a lot of work on public sector food and improving the food that's in offer in our schools and our hospitals and our workplace canteens. We've done a lot of work on supply chain, especially focusing on wholesale markets. And this is another good example. Previous speaker mentioned, learning from things that work and learning from things that failed. We invested a huge amount of money in trying to make supply chains into London's wholesale markets more sustainable. We partnered with the National Farmers Union and the City of London, and we spent a considerable amount of money, but on the whole it failed, except in New Covent Garden Market where they keep the work going. On alternative food networks, I think one of our most high-profile successes and most well-known pieces of work is our work around urban agriculture and urban food growing. That's the Mayor with Seb Coe, the head of the London Organising Committee. We used the Olympics again as a motivating tool. We said we'd create 2012 new food growing spaces in London by the Olympics, and we achieved that. The legacy project from that has been Every School a Food Growing School, which is run in conjunction with Garden Organic and Capital Growth, and our aim is to make every school in London growing food of some nature by the end of 2017. We've already got somewhere between 1/3 and 50% of schools doing food growing of some nature. This is, for us, is where the Alternative Food Network agenda meets up with the agenda of the key policy agendas at a London level at the moment. Everyone in London government is talking about entrepreneurial spirit, small and medium enterprise are the buzzword of the day. Everyone wants to support SMEs. Everyone wants to develop business hubs and a shared workspace and tech startups, and all of this dynamic is probably when you walk around City Hall, it's the main discourse that you hear. Capital growth has resulted in around about 100 new social entrepreneurs developing into businesses in the city, and some of the most exciting examples are in the periphery, where peri-urban agriculture has started to develop. Now, they're not purely based on selling food as a commodity only. They sell food, but they also sell training, employability skills, working with people with mental health issues, working with local schools, and they use and they do it very well, and they charge a fee for that, and that's how they make some of their money. And a very interesting initiative, and going back to Paolo's example of the role of government. In Enfield Council, they got a lot of money for urban food growing as a part of a regeneration project. And with the idea that these things actually create jobs, create new businesses, and create regeneration of areas. And what they're doing is they're investing in some land that's been run by tenanted farmers, and they're saying, you're only cultivating it for hay, which is used in the local equestrian centre. Why don't we take some of that land and we'll lease it to urban food growers and get them to produce food on scale? And that's investment, direct public investment in creating new horticultural projects in London. So that's just some of the successes of what we've done so far. And again, so looking at this, you've got to try and communicate in the language and policy makers get. And they get jobs, they get youth employment, they get diversity of retail offer on the high street. Suddenly there's a big crisis in Britain, the high street's dying. I mean, it's been dying for many years, but suddenly everyone's got it, from the Prime Minister through to Boris Johnson. Everyone's worried about the high street and regeneration and making sure that shops aren't empty. So we're doing a lot of work where we say alternative food networks are a fantastic way of regenerating high streets, because if you put a good food business in a high street, that attracts footfall to that area, and that footfall then spreads some of their spending in the other shops that exist in that high street. And we made a very successful argument to that effect. So we got investment from the GLA, so I mean that's the context. This is the other thing, selling the context of the economy to people in power. 1 in 4 jobs in London, 17 billion annual turnover, 25,000 businesses, majority of which are SMEs. So we now support, through grants and business support, small businesses that are doing healthy and sustainable food for Londoners on their high streets. We measure progress. This is a report that we do every year in conjunction with Sustain, and it looks at local authorities and ranks them. So how are they doing on sustainable fish? How are they doing on fair trade? How are they doing on animal welfare? It looks at healthier catering and measures what boroughs are doing, and then it creates a league table. So where are we at nearly 10 years on? Food embedded in London policy, local authorities engaged in food issues. London's food economy is more diverse than it's ever been. The power of procurement and public procurement is really understood, and you can only look at the growth of Food for Life Partnership and all of the work that that's doing, the stuff that's happening at a national level on hospitals. School food is transformed, and there's better engagement with big business, and we work with big business a lot more, food waste reducing. But our challenges are massive. Obesity is a huge problem. The poorest still have the worst outcomes, and food poverty is on the rise in a crazy dynamic that has really hit everyone. Food poverty is always there. I started work in London in 2002 for a food poverty charity in East London. It's always been there. The rise in the last few years has been staggering, and our environmental impact is far too great. Anyway, that's me. Thank you.